Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. This podcast is the second in a series of joint PRI and Claremont Institute 4th Anniversary Cruise Lectures. Our cruise took place in October, started in Barcelona, with stops in Mallorca, Marseille, Monte Carlo, Nice, Florence, and ending in Rome. The theme of the lectures was the future of America and the West, liberty, sovereignty, and self-government. This second lecture, titled The Past and Future of American Conservatism, was from PRI fellow and UC Berkeley professor Steve Hayward. He takes the audience through conservatism's evolution from its beginnings in the pre-World War II era to today, and along the way makes some interesting and penetrating observations. Thanks for joining us.
Ryan challenged me to give a talk titled The Past and Future of the Conservative Movement, and I foolishly agreed to try and do this in the scope of an hour or really less. I want to have a lot of time for discussion. I thought the way I would draw into this is talk a little bit about my next book project that I'm just starting on, but I'm writing a short biography of the late Stanton Evans, who was one of the premier figures, a very important figure in the conservative movement when it took, the modern conservative movement, when it took shape back in the 1950s. And his memory is already fading, even though he's only been gone from us for about 4 years now. He was my first mentor out of college. I worked for him for almost a year in Washington, D.C. as an intern, and kept up with him, used to talk to him on the phone after he fell ill in 2014. He was a journalist, one of those early journalist activists. He had a syndicated newspaper column for the Los Angeles Times Syndicate, did radio commentaries for CBS and even NPR at one point. Stanton Evans. Stan came on a couple of Hillsdale cruises. You might have even seen him once. His father was also an interesting guy. He was actually one of the first members of the Atomic Energy Commission back in the late 40s when it was founded, and a very conservative man himself. And one of the reasons to keep Stan alive is not only his style and the things I learned from him, especially about journalism, but also he was a man ahead of his time. And very much, if he was still with us, would be the perfect man for this time. We often talk about, gosh, what would Milton Friedman say about the trade policy of Trump, or what would William F. Buckley say? And we sort of wonder and can point to things. I think I know what Stan would say, and I'll come to that in a moment. Stan understood the necessity of political struggle. And, well, I'll put it this way. He liked to say two things. One, he'd say, it's a good thing Republican politicians oppose abortion since they spend most of their time in the fetal position. And to which he also liked to joke that the Centers for Disease Control has confirmed that conservatism is not spread by casual contact. And what he meant by that, a lot of people didn't get that joke. What he meant by that was, in politics, if you're not on offense, the only question is, how fast are you losing? Slowly or quickly? And his great talent, I've already suggested this, is he loved to invert liberal pieties and liberal cliches. So back in the 60s, you may remember the cliches in the New York Times and elsewhere. He liked to say, any country that can land a man on the moon can abolish the income tax. One of his later remarks, not quite political, but it showed you his keen mind, and he had a slow Texas drawl. It was the time that Lady Gaga showed up at one of the award shows in a dress made out of meat, pieces of meat sort of threaded and strung together. And Stan said, he pulled his chin and says, Lady Gaga is probably commenting on the existential frailty of the human condition, that we're all pieces of meat, destined to go the way of all flesh. And he paused and said, or perhaps she was just trying to call attention to herself. Right, he was full of those. Another one that I liked was, we all know where we were when we heard the terrible, horrible news of the death of Johnny Versace. But he did have some serious points. He had Evans' first law of insufficient paranoia, which he formed way back in the 60s, an important time. The first law of insufficient paranoia was, no matter how bad you think things are, it's invariably the case that when you look closer, things are even worse than you thought. And in fact, I think that Stan may have been the person who invented the phrase, the swamp. I think he was the person who said, too many conservatives come to Washington thinking they're going to drain the swamp, only to find that it's a hot tub. That phrase is still around some, and I think he might have originated that. I know he originated a similar line back in the late 60s under the Nixon years, which was, why is it whenever one of us gets into a position of power to do some good, he's no longer one of us? He understood the insidious nature of the way the permanent bureaucracy would swallow up political appointees who didn't have a really bad attitude. In 1971, as chairman of the American Conservative Union, he assembled a number of prominent conservatives. Bill Buckley begged off, unfortunately, I think, and they issued a public statement suspending their support for Richard Nixon and the Nixon administration. As Stan liked to put it at the time, there are only two things I don't like about the Nixon administration. It's domestic policy and it's foreign policy, right? But then Watergate came along, and this is where we begin to start to see the parallels with today. Watergate came along, and he recognized immediately that this was a coup. And although he never was really fond of Nixon, he did write a lot about the hypocrisy and bad faith of the liberals and the media in the whole way the Watergate story was spun out to ill effect. And then, of course, in typical Stan fashion, he liked to say later, a true conservative is someone who didn't support Nixon until after Watergate. Or as he put it at the time, after wage and price controls, Watergate was a breath of fresh air. He told me one time, typical fashion, we're having a drink late in the day, he said he called up over to the White House one day in the middle of the Watergate agony, and he said, gosh, I wouldn't have been so hard on you guys if I knew you'd been doing all this neat stuff. That was his style. Now, his final book, he wrote a lot of very good books. His last book was called Blacklisted by History. And it was a defense of Joe McCarthy, the successor in some ways to William F. Buckley and Brent Bozell's early book, McCarthy and Its Enemies. But Stan, being a journalist, wanted to get after some neglected facts. By the way, another one of his great jokes he used to love with liberals is, I didn't agree with what Joe McCarthy was trying to do, but I sure admired his methods. By the way, I heard him one day run through all of his greatest hits before an audience at Princeton at a conference Robbie George put together, and you have all these liberal professors and students, and they were all horrified. None of them could get the joke at all, and it actually took him literally, which is what he loved to do. But in Blacklisted by History, Stan's thought with some reasonable circumstantial evidence that the FBI had, quote-unquote, misfiled a lot of evidence from the McCarthy-era investigations, suppressed some evidence. He thought it might still be found, and so he did get lunch fixed up by our mutual friend, PRI's former chairman, our chairman emeritus, Dan Oliver, fixed up lunch with Stan and the director of the FBI, who turned out to be completely unhelpful in trying to search for any of the old files or things that might be lost in the FBI archives. Guess who that FBI director was? A guy named Robert Mueller. So there you go. This is why I say Stan would recognize the current moment quite well. The point is I have no doubt that if Stan were still with us, he'd be hugely enthusiastic about Trump. You know, one of his books in the 60s was called The Liberal Establishment, great big thick thing, and really described a lot of what we nowadays call the administrative state or the deep state, but he understood that this is a class interest at work. He understood very clearly where we are now, and I'll say that although Stan was a free trader, he did some graduate work with Ludwig von Mises at NYU, he persisted along with our late friend Bill Rusher in referring to China as the Chi-Coms, that phrase from the dates of the 50s that nobody else kept using. So he would understand that whatever the problems in practice of trade protectionism or tariffs might present, the priority of the politics of the matter were important. And I'm going to come back to that point in a moment. The reason I dwell on him is that he was such an important figure in the modern American conservative movement. That period in the 50s, Charles mentioned the other day, that I'm actually going to reconstruct and say was phase 2 of conservatism. So my main point is, I think you can make out a phase 1, there's a phase 2, and we are right now in the middle of what I'm calling phase 3. And now I'm going to understand this as a historical matter, even though this risks flirting with historicism, which always scares me a little bit. You cast your mind back to 1991, when the Soviet Union officially dissolved itself, a glorious moment. And we all remember that this was declared the end of history, right? We thought it was going to be open markets, democracy, privatization as far as the eye could see. And, you know, President George H.W. Bush talked about a new world order, a dubious phrase that should have given us more pause than it did, even coming from him at the time. And out there in the middle of all that at the end of 1991, there was our great friend Harry Jaffa saying, wait a minute, there's a big problem here. He gave a lecture that ended as follows. The defeat of communism in the Soviet Union and its satellite empires by no means assures its defeat in the world. Second sentence, this is the key one, I think. Indeed, the release of the West from its conflict with the East emancipates utopian communism at home from the suspicion of its affinity with an external enemy. And as conclusion, the struggle for the preservation of Western civilization has entered a new and perhaps far more deadly and dangerous phase. Turns out to have been completely right about that. not 20 years later, socialism was back and openly proclaimed. You may remember the Newsweek cover when Obama came into office. We're all socialists now. Privatizations have been reversed, and the authoritarian left revealed itself quite openly, what it used to at least try to semi-conceal. Around now on campus, I can tell you, the big thing is neoliberalism, which I keep asking some of the people who talk about this in their dense jargon. How is neoliberalism different from what we used to call capitalism? Turns out to be the same thing, but you ask this question and you just get the fog machine and disco lights cranked up, and it's all thick with jargon. But neoliberalism really means everything about the modern society that we don't like. It's the simple phrase. I have a whole lexicon for these things. A racist is anyone who disagrees with a liberal, right? A populism is when the wrong people win elections. I have a whole long list of those. So what happened? What did we miss? How did this happen? And as I say, I think there are some historically contingent reasons for this. The analogy I like to use, if you follow, I guess it's college basketball, is they no longer have a jump ball when there's a tie-up between two players. We now have the possession arrow. So there's a tie-up, the arrow goes to the team who owns the arrow at the time. I know this is somewhat simplistic, but I think in the 60s and especially in the 70s and the 80s, our side enjoyed the possession arrow on questions of political economy. The failures of socialism and statism were too obvious to deny, and our remedies were clearly superior, and the performance into the 80s and into the 90s vindicated that. However, cunning of history, by the late 1990s, early 2000s, the idea of free markets began to be on the defensive. I have a whole lot of examples of this, but I'll just name one, and it's one close to us in California, and that was when, 18 years ago now, whatever it was, we started having rolling blackouts because it was said we deregulated electric utilities. It was nothing of the sort. It was a really dumb re-regulation and restructuring. If we'd done it the way Texas had done it, we would have been fine. Most of the country followed Texas. We'd be better off, right? And notwithstanding, we published a long paper by Ben Zeiker, a very good energy economist, explaining this, except it's complicated, and the public didn't really want to hear it. And what I say is we lost the possession arrow. And then you have, of course, the financial crisis of 10, 11 years ago. Same problem. The public thinks and the media reiterates all kinds of misinformation about it. And, when you're explaining and you're on the defensive, you're losing, right? So I like to say as a metaphor for this that we lost the possession arrow and we're struggling to get it back. So I said there were three phases to conservatism. Charles already mentioned, and I just referred to it, the modern movement starting in the 50s, which, as Charles said, and I agree, was more explicitly political than conservatism had been before. And that's why I say pre-World War II conservatism, it was literary, it was really fun to read, people like Albert J. Nock. You can't really go wrong with a book called Our Enemy, the State. And Nock was a wonderful stylist and kind of a mentor of sorts to William F. Buckley. On the other hand, he was somewhat, and I think he's a representative figure for pre-war conservatism. He was, I won't say apolitical, but he was anti-political. And to give you one example that's always odd, if any of you, have you ever read his biography of Thomas Jefferson? It's great reading, and it doesn't mention the Declaration of Independence once. It's the oddest thing. It'd be like, writing a book about biography of Marx and leaving out Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. It's really strange about Nock, even though he's enjoyable to read. So it's that second phase in the 50s when thinkers like Stanton Evans, Bill Buckley, go on down the list, said, we need to be more deliberately political in our disposition. Now, during those years, there was this great debate amongst the intellectuals between liberty and virtue. Liberty represented, the free marketeers like Milton Friedman and Hayek, perhaps. Virtue represented the traditionalists like Russell Kirk, for example. And they'd have these debates about this that are really reflective of that famous old line from Edmund Burke, from early in his reflections on the revolution in France. You may know this one. If not, it goes as follows. The effect of liberty to individuals is that they may do what they please. We ought to see what will please them to do before we risk congratulations, which may soon be turned into complaints. And so during those years, there was this great effort at what was then called fusionism. Maybe we can harmonize these two different approaches to public affairs and public policy. Occasionally, these debates would break out into a certain amount of personal bitterness. One thinks of Russell Kirk's spirited attack on libertarians called the chirping sectaries, as he called them. And then on the other hand, there was Friedrich Hayek, who is said to have blocked Russell Kirk's membership in the Mont Pelerin Society, who is said to have written Why I Am Not a Conservative, that essay at the end of the Constitution of Liberty, in response to Kirk's The Conservative Mind. Libertarians like to wave that essay around and say, see, why I'm not a conservative. And I always say, have you read it? Because in the middle of it, Hayek says, America's different. In America, you're defending the genuine liberal tradition, and therefore you can be a conservative in America. American conservatism and European conservatism are different. And you point this out to a sort of what I call a gear drive libertarian, and they say, they hadn't read that part or didn't understand it. I don't know. But the point is that I think sort of free market, I don't like to say purism is too strong a word, but the existential struggle against communism meant that free markets were the easy point of convergence. Or to maybe even more direct and blunt about that. In those days, it was easy to go along with the primacy of economics over politics. That made sense. The rejection of free market economics was at the core of our mortal enemy. And I think that phase 3 of conservatism, as I'm calling it today, has now reversed the priority. Now it's the priority of politics over economic. You can do this several different ways. We can say that conservatism for a long time was bonded, we might say, under the theory of economic man. Today we are seeing that, in fact, it should be political man understood, politics rightly understood. But even during the Cold War years, this, what I'm suggesting, was not as neat and clean. You had bitter debates during the Nixon years and especially in the early Reagan years. Should we be selling, for example, wheat to the Soviet Union? A lot of people, they had bitter debates in the Reagan White House about this. The embargo had started under Carter, and one of the things Reagan said was, why should only farmers be bearing the brunt of this? Or a year later, John O'Sullivan knows this story very well, Reagan sought to delay or block the Soviet gas pipeline into Western Europe on very sensible geopolitical grounds, led to a lot of acrimonious disagreement with Prime Minister Thatcher, a lot of difficult moments. The point is, if the Soviet Union still existed today, I think we'd have no trouble saying to Google or Apple or all these companies, no, you may not, outsource your manufacturing to those countries. Or, in Apple's case, another despicable act is just the other day, Apple took down an app that the protesters in Hong Kong had been using to organize themselves, declaring it to be illegal. Why? Well, because the Chinese leaned on them. And while Apple says we're all for freedom in America, they knuckle under immediately. Or just this morning, the general manager of the Houston Rockets basketball team, a day or two ago, put out a tweet saying something like, support the Hong Kong protesters, freedom for Hong Kong. And the Chinese retaliated right away, threatening the Houston Rockets. A number of sponsors have withdrawn themselves. The tweet's been taken down and an apology has been issued. And as I say, in the Cold War era, China may or may not, this is a subject for another day, China may or may not represent an ideological threat commensurate with the Soviet Union, but are certainly a piratical regime. We know that. That's why I think someone like Stanton Evans and even probably Milton Friedman would say Trump is generally right in what he is trying to do, even if the details are difficult. So I'll conclude this way and we'll move to questions. I think that it's fortuitous that we have the Claremont Institute and the Pacific Research Institute together here, because I think we represent the new fusionism in a certain way. The Claremont Institute is dedicated to political philosophy. PRI has been dedicated primarily to political economy. And we have a great challenge. I'll put it this way. We want to think about measures that, to use the old simple cliche, I guess, is that don't kill the golden goose, right? This is the worry about trade tariffs. But we live in an era of left-wing capitalists. This is sort of unthinkable even 25 years ago, right? Most of Silicon Valley leaders are deeply left. And sometimes 10 years ago now, Charles Murray and I were discussed about whether or not we should be for higher taxes on the Silicon Valley zillionaires because they should be punished for their idiocy. We had quite a vigorous debate with some of our colleagues about this who thought not. So the challenge for us is to craft general and specific measures that don't backfire on us. The public choice theorists are right that when the government starts to intervene in economies, you create a playground for rent seekers and people seeking special status. The landscape already has tons of this, like ethanol and the windmills and solar panels and all this other nonsense. And we don't want to deepen and replicate that problem, but that's our challenge, and that's a really big one. So I think what I'll do is I will stop here, have another swig of coffee, and then we can have some questions and discussion. You said, right, there we go.
Special thanks to Steve Hayward. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.